smartphone in your pocket could cost you another $500 next year. A kid's $50 tricycle could cost you another $30. The refrigerator that you've been looking at online, it could go from $650 to $800. These are real economic projections tied to President Trump's proposed tariffs. He announced that there would be a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, an additional 10% tariff on the 60% tariff that he's already proposed for China, and a 10 to 20% tariff for all other countries bringing goods into the United States. This is a very big deal. But US markets barely flinched at the news. So what do they know that we don't? So today, I'm going to talk about what tariffs are, how they work, how President-elect Trump is thinking about them, and what it could mean for the future of global trade and your wallet. Simply put, tariffs are taxes on stuff coming into the United States, or the things that we import. When Walmart brings in a $100 product, the government says, hey, you have to pay us 25% extra on that. And Walmart says, all right, we'll just charge customers $125 now. And this isn't speculation. Companies are already telling us exactly what they'll do. AutoZone, Walmart, and Target, and Stanley, Black & Decker, and many more have all explicitly said that they'll pass these costs onto you. The National Retail Federation even said, quote, retailers rely heavily on imported products and manufacturing components so that they can offer their customers a variety of products at affordable prices. A tariff is a tax paid by the US importer, not a foreign country or the exporter. This tax ultimately comes out of consumers' pockets through higher prices. It doesn't get clearer than that. It doesn't become a tax on the importer. A tariff becomes a tax on the consumer. And if we go back in time for a second, for most of US history, tariffs were how the government made money. From 1789 to 1862, nearly all federal revenue came from tariffs. Then came income taxes in 1913, and everything changed. And so you pay taxes to get a sewage system, electricity, roads, etc. We also got burned by tariffs pretty badly in the 1930s. The Smoot-Hawley Act taught us a critical lesson: broad-based tariffs often backfire, harming both domestic and global economies. It was meant to protect farmers, but everyone wanted in, so we ended up with this 20% tax on everything coming into the United States, which resulted in a drop in global trade and a worsening of the Great Depression. Other countries responded with retaliatory tariffs, and it was such a disaster that we're still talking about it nearly 100 years later as a way to warn against broad-based tariffs. And today, tariffs are used more as economic and foreign policy tools to try and protect domestic industries, respond to unfair trade practices, and basically boss everyone around. And Trump likes them for that, of course. He says the tariffs will generate revenue and thinks that they will protect American industries and create jobs. He also sees them as a strategy to keep other countries in line, which they absolutely can be if they are targeted. He wants to do broad-based tariffs. He also wants to use them to pay for tax cuts, a big part of his campaign promise. Tax cuts on tips, tax cuts on overtime, tax cuts on Social Security, and perhaps even an end to the federal income tax. So let's quickly discuss how the government makes money. The government makes money from three types of taxes: individual income taxes, payroll taxes, and corporate income taxes. Income taxes are 54% of federal revenue. If the government spending outweighs what it earns, that's a deficit, which we basically always have, and we have to borrow money in order to close that gap in the form of treasuries. But income taxes generate $2 trillion in revenue. Again, we have $3 trillion in imports, so we would have to tax all imports at almost 70% to get even close to replacing just income tax. But it gets even more expensive. The plan for extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act alone will cost $4 trillion over the next decade. We have to pay for that somehow. And to the point of the Department of Government Efficiency, 86% of government spending is locked into mandatory programs like Social Security and Medicare. Even $1 trillion in tariff revenue over a decade won't fund proposed tax cuts. It would be a $3 trillion gap. So these tariffs are not going to raise enough money, and they actually could hurt us. And he has the full power to pass these tariffs without congressional approval, although it could definitely be challenged in court. But he seems intent on passing them. Currently, there's about a trade-weighted average of a 2% tariff on most imported goods. And the new proposal is staggering. There's a 60% base rate on Chinese goods, with a recently announced additional 10% penalty, 25% on Mexican imports, and 25% on Canada if they don't stop illegal drug shipments and illegal immigration, 10 to 20% on everyone everyone else. To put this into perspective, Mexico alone sends us about $500 billion in goods annually. A 25% tariff means $100 billion in new taxes yearly, about $1 trillion over a decade, as Jeff Stein has mentioned. Canada provides us cement and minerals and lumber and metal, and slapping tariffs on them would mean about $40 billion in taxes yearly. Yikes. But what's interesting is the market doesn't seem to be taking Trump very seriously. They don't seem to care. The stock market is up. The stock market vigilantes will keep Trump in line, presumably, because he does care what the market thinks, understandably. So if we see a sell-off in the stock market, it could reverse all of the things we just talked about. We do have a long way to go. It is only November, but the market seems to be responding this way because, number one, they've seen this before. In 2018, Trump announced huge tariffs, but there were all sorts of exemptions and implementation was pretty messy. And number two, they're betting that the Federal Reserve would step in to prevent economic damage, and most importantly, they think Congress or the courts might block the most extreme measures. But here's the twist: even if the market is right and these tariffs never fully materialize, the mere threat of them is already raising prices. When companies stockpile inventory, they tie up cash that they could use elsewhere, they create artificial shortages, and they drive up shipping and storage costs and pass these new costs to consumers. And companies are already doing this. S&P Global said last week in their PMI, factories are meanwhile stepping up their purchases of imported inputs as they seek to front-run tariffs, putting pressure on supply chains to a degree not seen in over 2 years. Any further stretching of these supply lines could see prices move higher as demand outstrips supply. So we're caught in this weird situation where markets are calm, but your wallet is already getting hit. And it's important to note that we already have tariffs in place. Trump did instate some on about $380 billion of goods in 2018 and 2019, and Biden added an additional $18 billion. But those were targeted on certain goods and only to China. Also, these did not work. As Economic Forces wrote, when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese auto parts in 2018, it did not protect American jobs at all. Instead, it raised costs for US automakers who relied on imported components. Higher input costs led to slower export growth and job losses in affected industries. And Scott Bessent, likely Treasury Secretary, proposes a 3-tier approach. He wants the lowest rates for cooperative allies, higher rates for countries buying Russian oil, highest rates for strategic competitors. He argues that this functions like sanctions. You're rewarding friends, you're punishing the people you don't like. And he also sees it as a 10-year project, which is all about making China rebalance their economy. But there's also flaws. He says that 40 to 50% of tariff costs get offset by currency adjustments. And so what he means here is that when tariffs make Chinese goods more expensive, fewer people buy them. Lower demand for Chinese goods means lower demand for Chinese currency, and the weaker Chinese currency makes their goods cheaper, and it partially canceled out the tariff. But it doesn't work like this. It takes months or even years for this to happen, and meanwhile the consumer is paying higher prices. And it works differently for other countries, right? Smaller countries have less influence over their currency markets. And the Federal Reserve adds a whole other layer of complexity. If currency moves get too dramatic, the Fed might step in and move rates, limiting how much prices can actually adjust. We saw this play out in 2018 when we had a trade war, when the Chinese currency fell 10% against the dollar. It offset about a third of the tariff impact, but it took several months to happen, and different products saw widely varying effects. He also says that exporters absorb some costs to stay competitive, and when tariffs hit all goods, every company is facing the exact same cost increase. There's not a competitive advantage in absorbing the cost if all your rivals are raising prices too. During Trump's first round of tariffs in 2018, studies showed that American consumers bore almost the entire burden through higher prices. He also says that the impact isn't a direct one-to-one price increase. And yeah, that's true. If you have a 100% tariff, prices aren't going to go up by 100%. They actually go up by more, because the full 60% tariff is not a clean 60% price increase, but companies do round up. If they're okay, 25% tariff, I'm going to raise prices by 30% to cover higher inventory carrying costs, supply chain problems, shipping fees, new paperwork, compliance. And companies aren't waiting to see if they can absorb these costs. They're stockpiling inventory, they're rerouting supply chains, they're telling shareholders they'll maintain profit margins because we do have a shareholder-driven economy. Public traded companies have a duty to maintain profitability. That's like kind of the issue that we have right now. So absorbing massive cost increases is not an option when you have to report quarterlies. And in sectors with thin profit margins like retail, there simply is not the room to absorb 25 to 60% cost increase without raising prices. And so there is a severe economic consequence because it impacts all sorts of goods, the finished goods we import, as well as the intermediate, so the stuff that we use to make other things like steel for cars. It's not just about prices, it's about the entire cost of moving factories and developing workarounds and creating waste that never needed to be created. And so basically two things could happen with broad-based tariffs. The traditional view is people buy less because everything's more expensive, leading to job losses and slower growth. And the modern reality is people just borrow more money to keep buying the same stuff, creating new debt cycles. The Tax Foundation estimates that we could lose about 140,000 full-time jobs. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that Trump's proposed tariffs could elevate inflation by over 1 percentage point more than it otherwise would have been in the coming year. Tariffs reduce GDP by about $1 trillion. There are estimates this could cost the average American $4,000 a year. This is all nonpartisan, by the way. All think tanks of every type of think believe that these tariffs could cost American families thousands of dollars. And so if these are implemented, we could see supply chain restructuring, increased consumer debt, higher prices, shifting global trade alliances, domestic manufacturing advantages, and currency market adjustments. The tariff debate isn't just about prices. It's about power, politics, and global economic relationships. Markets might be shrugging it off now, but if these actually get implemented, it could totally reshape global trade. Mexico already said that they would retaliate. And whether the tariffs happen or not, companies are already preparing, meaning that prices are already going to rise. And the real question isn't whether or not prices will rise from tariffs, because they will. Companies have said as much. But whether the policy achieves its strategic goals. If you're meant to be protecting the US consumer, protecting US industry, why would you do this? Targeted tariffs are a different story, but broad-based tariffs end up hurting American consumers and the economy. And the biggest question that we have to ask is who's bearing the brunt of these prices, and is it really worth it?